Jon Snow walked slowly across the snow-laden courtyard of Winterfell, the bitter wind of the north rustling his dark cloak around his shoulders. The godswood loomed behind him, its ancient heart tree, blanketed in a thin layer of ice, crimson leaves barely rustling in the biting cold. The ghosts of the battle still hung in the air, echoes of screams, the rancid stench of blood, and the memory of chaos etched into the stone walls. Patches of red-brown slush stained the ground where horses had stumbled and men had bled. Despite the swirling flakes of winter's breath, fires burned in braziers, offering meager warmth to the soldiers standing guard. Each one bore the marks of that savage fight: torn cloaks, fresh scars, eyes haunted by death. He paused near the spot where Ramsay Bolton had once addressed his troops. The wind carried a faint metallic tang of blood. Jon found himself overwhelmed for a moment, remembering how many good men had perished beneath that frigid sky. Loyal wildlings, the men of House Mormont and House Hornwood, men from the smaller houses called upon in dire times. They had rallied behind him, or behind Sansa, or behind the very idea that Winterfell must be freed from its usurpers. Now the dust of battle had settled, and yet Jon felt anything but triumphant. Victory came with a terrible cost, and the final cry of the dying could never be erased. The walls, battered in places, remained standing. Winterfell, though battered itself, still belonged to the Starks. The battered gate squeaked under the weight of reinforcement as men hustled supplies in and out. The ravens in the rookery had begun their frantic cawing again. Messenger birds fluttered out into the gray sky, carrying word of House Stark's reclamation of its ancestral seat. Jon's breath plumed in the cold as he looked toward the keep where Sansa would be. He thought of her quiet resilience, the grim set of her mouth when she had confronted Ramsay for the last time. The old ways and the old lines returned to Winterfell, but nothing remained untouched by sorrow. He found himself remembering the face of Rickon, who lay now in the crypts below, forever stilled by an arrow meant to break Jon's spirit. The memory of that tragic chase across the open field weighed heavily on Jon, each footstep a haunting echo. That memory would likely live with him forever. It made him question everything: his leadership, his capacity for hope, even whether the gods favored him at all. Yet the North had named him the man who reclaimed Winterfell, the White Wolf, the king in the North for some. It was a title he'd neither expected nor sought. But the name was whispered in the corridors, murmured in the corners of the great hall, passed from soldier to soldier. The knowledge of it left a dull ache in his chest. As he paused near a frozen patch of earth, one of the men recognized him and straightened. "My lord," the soldier said, bowing stiffly. Jon offered a faint nod of acknowledgement before turning his gaze toward the battered battlements. The soldier lowered his eyes in respect and moved away, presumably not wanting to disturb his brooding. Jon was grateful for the peace. The swirling flake settled on his hair, leaving droplets of water that melted into his dark curls, and for a few moments he listened to the stiff hush of Winterfell's courtyard, where ghosts seemed to brush past unseen. He made his way inside, stepping over the threshold into the main hall that had once been silent under Bolton occupation. It was alive with murmuring voices now. Fires crackled in large hearths, and the wounded too were gathered in the corners, bandaged and moaning softly. Maesters and healers rushed about, distributing poultices and water. The mood was subdued. Despite the warm glow of torchlight dancing against the stones, a gloom lurked. The price of their liberation weighed heavily in the air. Sansa was seated at the high table, poring over a scroll with a crease in her brow. Her red hair cascaded around her shoulders, and exhaustion lined her face. But there was a determination in the set of her jaw that made Jon's heart tighten. She had seen so much, endured so much. Yet here she was, fighting still, for Winterfell, for the memory of their family. She caught sight of him and stood. "Jon," she said quietly, voice still raw from days of tension and too little rest. He joined her, noticing how the other lords, or those who had survived, were congregated nearby. Lyanna Mormont, fierce and steadfast despite her youth, stood with her small retinue. Lord Glover, along with a few others, hovered in the background. They were all studying the battered surfaces of the hall and the ragged men who had accompanied them to victory. A hush fell as Jon approached. Some nodded, some bowed their heads. Lyanna Mormont gave her usual stoic stare. Jon set a hand gently on Sansa's shoulder, feeling the tension coil there. She exhaled softly, offering him a small, weary smile. In the midst of heartbreak, seeing a part of her family was a comfort. Yet the burdens upon them remained immense. Bolton banners had been burned, their remnants scattered like dirty ashes in the courtyard. Already, in the corners, newly embroidered direwolf banners were being prepared to be hung once again. The Stark insignia claimed its rightful place. But what happened next? Jon was no lord. He had sworn oaths to the Night's Watch, had died in black, and though resurrected, miraculously, unbelievably, he still wrestled with who he was meant to be. His oath had ended with his death, or so he believed. But a sense of duty remained tethered to his soul. He saw the need in the eyes of the men around him. The North was not safe merely because they had retaken Winterfell. There were greater dangers looming. Horrors that cast shadows across the snow even now. They conferred in low voices. Sansa explained the status of supplies. The granaries were half empty, the winter stores ill-prepared for a long freeze. Many soldiers required more robust clothing for the creeping cold. Jon listened, nodding gravely. He had grown used to the privations at the wall, but the men and women here needed leadership that could protect them from starvation. Meanwhile, there was talk of alliances. The Vale had proven itself a powerful friend, or at least, Lord Baelish had proven cunning enough to arrive at the last moment. Jon felt uneasy about Baelish's presence, but for now, he was an ally. Lord Glover cleared his throat. "We must see to it the Bolton's loyal men are dealt with." His voice carried the weight of old grudges. Some fled into the countryside. They could rally again if we don't root them out. "That's not our only worry," said Lady Mormont, her voice clear. "The Lannisters still hold the Iron Throne. The news from King's Landing is sparse, but rumors claim the boy King Tommen is dead, and the city is in chaos. We must prepare for the consequences of that power vacuum." Dynasty. Sansa's gaze flickered to Jon. She had told him earlier of rumors that King's Landing teetered on the brink of civil unrest, with queens and would-be kings vying for position. But that felt so far away. Jon only truly cared about the threat beyond the wall, the swarm of undead that threatened to descend upon all living. Yet the hearts around him were fired by something else. The old game, the old politics. It was a problem that he could not simply ignore. The North might find itself in the crosshairs of a southern power play if it did not brace for the next phase. Later that evening, Jon found a moment of respite near one of the smaller hearths. A battered table stood there, upon which lay scattered maps of the North. The flickering candlelight illuminated the lines of territory once held by the Boltons, Karstarks, Umbers, some loyal, some treacherous, and now, all in disarray. A faint footstep behind him caused Jon to glance over his shoulder. Davos Seaworth stepped into the warm circle of light, his posture tentative, eyes reflecting a fatherly concern. "Snow," Davos said, his voice low. "I see the weight upon you. Victory, yes, but at a terrible cost. And I know what it means to you to see so many lost, so many orphans left behind." Jon nodded, the memory of the battlefield refusing to fade. He could still recall Davos' expression that morning, when they had found the remnants of the pyre that once belonged to Shireen. The man was grieving in his own way. Jon reached for the edge of the table, palms pressed down as though grounding himself. "We fought for Winterfell," he replied quietly, "but the battles don't end with a single victory." Davos inhaled, drawing a breath that wavered with weariness. "The lords will gather soon. They'll want decisions." Lady Mormont's not the only one speaking of power vacuums. "Some talk has begun." He paused, choosing his words. "Some say you must press a claim, secure the North fully, or even aim higher." Jon's voice hardened slightly. "I want no part of these games. I only want to keep the North safe. Nothing else matters with winter upon us, and the threat that lies beyond the wall is real. It looms over us all, even those who scoff at it." Davos lowered his gaze. "I know, but a leader must sometimes weigh the here and now. If rumors of King's Landing are true, the realm could become fractured. The Lannisters, the Tyrells, perhaps the Martells, and there are whispers of Daenerys Targaryen across the sea. Our piece of the puzzle can't remain isolated. Jon's chest constricted. He remembered how he had once traveled south, how he had once been confronted with politics that nearly destroyed his family. All he had ever wanted was to protect those he loved from the nightmares that lurked in the world. But destiny seemed bent on dragging him into the thick of it again. Silently he bid Davos good night, too weary to argue any further. He needed rest, though sleep felt as distant as the summer sun. He found himself wandering the corridors, making his way to the new quarters prepared for him. These rooms had been left vacant or ransacked by the Boltons. But in the last day, the servants had done their best to tidy them. It wasn't the comfort that mattered, but the solitary silence it offered. He was about to slip inside when he heard a quiet voice calling him. Turning, he saw Sansa again, her face illuminated by the weak glow of a single torch. She came closer, searching his eyes. "Jon," she said in a hush, "I want to apologize. I should have told you about the possibility of the Knights of the Vale. I was afraid you'd rely on them too much or that Littlefinger would use it against us, or I simply wasn't sure he'd come at all. He stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "Sansa, we survived this because of you. I'm only sorry we couldn't save Rickon." A raw ache bled into his voice. "I'll always carry that regret." She nodded, tears brimming but not falling. "We have to be stronger now. The North is ours, but the rest of the realm might come for us, or at least try to entangle us. People are whispering about the Iron Throne. Some believe the Lannisters' hold is weak and that we—" Jon released a long breath. "I don't want it. I never did. This is not the time." She put a hand on his forearm. "I know, but the Lords whisper. They see you as Ned Stark's son, as the hero who united the wildlings and the North to reclaim Winterfell. And if they learn more about your birth, if anyone stumbles upon the truth, who knows what they'll clamor for? We must decide how to act before others decide for us." Her words lingered, a reminder that his parentage was not the simple story he had believed all his life. The truth of who he was hovered in the air like a latent storm, ready to reshape everything if it emerged. She left him there with his thoughts, heading back down the corridor, her torch's flickering glow diminishing with each step. Jon turned to his room, stepping inside to find it spare, quiet, and cold. He closed the door and sank into a chair by the unlit hearth, burying his face in his hands, overwhelmed by a tide of conflicting duties. Hours later, dawn's light filtered through the frosted windows, painting the chamber in a dull gray. A new day began in Winterfell with the clatter of hooves in the courtyard, men calling for their horses, the clang of steel as blacksmiths resumed their never-ending tasks. Jon rose, stiff from a restless night, and emerged into the corridor. He passed the tapestry-laden walls and took the winding staircase down to the great hall, where a modest breakfast had been laid out. Soldiers and servants came and went, far fewer than in the castle's glory days, but a start. The hush of respect that fell when Jon entered was something he feared would never feel right. He offered an awkward nod and made his way to a side table, picking a piece of bread and some thin soup. He saw Tormund Giantsbane in a corner, devouring his meal with hungry gusto. The wildling wore a bandage around one arm, his bright hair pulled back from his rugged face. When Tormund spotted Jon, he raised a tankard in greeting and beckoned. Jon wove through the men to join him. Tormund's voice boomed over the muttering of the hall. "There's the man of the hour," he said, a grin warping his mouth. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Feels like it," Jon said with a half-smile. "I've had a few things on my mind." Tormund snorted. "Rest, you fool. Didn't I tell you once you think too much? You have a face like a goat that's eaten sour grass." He tore another hunk of bread with his teeth, chewing noisily. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice slightly. "These Southron lords, I don't trust half of them. But if they want to call you king, let them. You saved them from that bastard Bolton. Besides, if you're king, maybe we can get more food. Proper mead, too." Jon shook his head. "It's not that simple, Tormund. The North is in no shape for war, and there are bigger threats." Tormund swallowed. "Yeah, I've seen those. Things, Jon. The ones you want to fight. I saw the army of the dead with my own eyes. If you think calling yourself king helps get more men to your side, you should do it. Because we're going to need every warm body that can hold a sword or arrow when the dead march. Jon nodded, absorbing Tormund's words. The wildling might be crass, but there was a blunt wisdom to him. They were all soldiers against the dark. Maybe the crown was just another tool in that war, though it felt like a curse. Midday came with an audience in Winterfell's main hall. Lords and ladies, as many as could be roused from their battered keeps, gathered to discuss the future. The rush of air from the open doors carried a chill through the hall, rustling the newly hung Stark banners. Jon stood at the front, Sansa by his side. Davos and Tormund hovered a little behind them. The older lords, men with lines of experience etched into their faces, seemed wary, while the younger ones had the spark of excitement dancing in their eyes. The room was quiet until Lord Glover stepped forward, clearing his throat. "My lord," Glover began, casting a lingering glance around, as though uncertain who truly held authority. He settled on Jon. "We have retaken Winterfell, but the Bolton's allies remain. We must quell any lingering disloyalty. We also must gather the harvest from outlying lands. Winter is at our doorstep. We're short on everything: grain, livestock, fodder. Our men can't last a long winter on half rations." Next, a man from House Serwyn voiced agreement. "We need stability. It's not enough to have the castle. The North must unite fully behind House Stark, and we must send messages to the Southern Lords. If we don't, we'll leave ourselves vulnerable to whoever seizes the Iron Throne next." "Monsieur." Jon listened, arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing the thick leather jerkins and furs typical of a northern leader, though he hardly felt comfortable in them. His mind churned. The old Ned Stark would have known how to proceed, measured and honorable. Jon tried to imagine what his father, who was truly his uncle, would have done. The memory of Ned's quiet strength filled him with longing and sadness. It was Lyanna Mormont who spoke up next, with her usual lack of hesitation. "We named you the king in the North once, Jon Snow. Or at least you are the man who reclaimed Winterfell. Some call you Ned Stark's son. Some call you the White Wolf. Now as for me and my house, we remember your valor and your loyalty to our cause." She squared her small shoulders, voice carrying a note of command that belied her youth. "If the realm to the south is crumbling, we cannot let them decide our fate. We must declare whom we follow, or we risk being led astray by chaos." Then, a murmur spread through the hall. The room's tension crackled like logs in the hearth. Jon could sense the shift, the push. All eyes fell upon him. Sansa stood close, her fingers tight around the edge of the table in front of them. Davos' expression was serious. Tormund's brows furrowed in mild confusion at all the formality. Jon took a breath. "You all know me. I was Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. My duty was to protect the realm from threats beyond the wall. When I died, that duty ended. But I still remember what lies out there. You can debate the Iron Throne. You can speak of kings and crowns. But the greatest war is coming from the North, and I need your help to stop it." "They?" Lord Glover, intrigued but still uncertain, pressed. "We hear these rumors of White Walkers, but some say..." Jon's voice rose, calm but firm, an edge of desperation. "I have seen them. Men who joined me at the wall have seen them. Wilds have fought them. The dead walk, and winter is their weapon. I ask you to believe this threat is real. If the living cannot unite, then none of these talk of crowns matters. The army of the dead will destroy us all. Better water." A silence stretched, heavy as iron. Some looked skeptical, but Lady Mormont's dark eyes glistened with conviction. "We stand behind you, King in the North. Whether it's a war for the living, or a war for the realm, you will have our swords." Sansa placed a hand on Jon's forearm, stepping forward. "We will gather the harvest. We will secure the roads. But we must be prepared for what comes from the south too. There may be pretenders, invaders. While we must not abandon the threat from beyond the wall, we can't ignore that the Lannisters may wish to punish the North for defying them. We must be ready." "Nanter." Lord Serwyn nodded, agreement plain on his face. Then let it be so. Let us name Jon Snow as Lord of Winterfell, or, if it must be more, we can call him King in the North again. Our loyalty will stand if he can unite us, yet we must manage the politics beyond the neck. Otherwise, the North will be isolated, and that might lead to destruction. Jon's voice was weighed with reluctance, but also determination. I will do what I must. But know this, my priority is protecting our people. If naming me something is what it takes for others to unite, so be it. I won't let the North be ground under the heel of any southern tyrant. And I won't forget the threat in the far north. I ask for your trust, your swords, and your word to stand by me in the days to come. Diribidai. The hall erupted in a subdued chorus of assent, men murmuring their agreement. The warm swell of acceptance, tempered by the quiet aftershock of war. Jon Snow, the man once called a bastard, found himself at the center of these uncertain loyalties. When the gathering disbanded, the banners of various houses parted ways, each returning to their respective corners of Winterfell, or preparing to ride back to their keeps. Jon's eyes were heavy as he watched them go. Sansa beside him. She let out a breath. A step forward, she said softly. We've made a statement today that we won't be bound to the Bolton's tyranny, nor to any who would refuse our independence. But I sense fear. They know a bigger game is at play. Jon gave a small nod, acknowledging her words. We've taken the first step. The next ones. He trailed off, unsure how to shape the future when so many dangerous pieces lay scattered across the board. A few days passed in a blur of logistics. Surviving knights scoured the local countryside for Bolton stragglers. Groups of armed men set out to gather the winter stores from farms and villages, carrying letters of safe passage sealed with the Stark sigil. Sansa and Jon spent hours reviewing every detail, from the number of loaves needed per day to the number of archers that could still draw a bow. The old maester's seat remained vacant, but the training staff in Winterfell's library did their best to assist in the organization. Even the ravens brought new tidings daily. Some ominous, some cryptic. Flea Bottom riots, a rumor of a queen's coronation in King's Landing, uncertain alliances. Sansa read each scroll with quiet intensity, feeling the magnitude of what might come. Late one evening, as the moon hung high and pale above the battlements, Jon stood on the ramparts overlooking the courtyard. His breath misted in the cold as he glanced at the star-filled sky. The phrase "King in the North" circled through his mind, a title he had never truly wanted. But the men needed to call him something. The day's events pressed down on him. A meager harvest from certain regions, disputes arising between lesser houses, the knowledge that the Lannisters might not leave the North's defiance unpunished. He wondered if somewhere, in the bowels of the afterlife he had briefly touched, the gods were smirking at him. Was this always to be his fate? A rustle of movement broke his thoughts. He turned to see Davos approaching, the older knight's cloak snapping in the breeze. Couldn't sleep? Davos asked. Jon gave a wan smile. Too many things on my mind. Davos nodded sympathetically, resting his elbows on the stone. I never wanted to be hand of a king or to be in the thick of power. Yet I followed Stannis because I believed in duty. His voice went softer. You have to lead these people, Jon. They've chosen you, or the gods have, or both. You won't always know the next step. Sometimes, you'll choose wrong. But you're the best chance they have. Dai. Jon stared out at the silent, sprawling fields that lay beyond Winterfell's walls. I once said I was no king. I'm a bastard. Davos chuckled, a dry, sardonic sound. As far as I see, bastards, cripples, and broken things are the ones shaping this world now. Wear your crown if you must, or call yourself simply Lord of Winterfell. It matters less what title you hold, and more what deeds you do. Jon sighed. I wish Father were here. Or Robb. Or even if... He shook his head, not finishing the thought. If Rickon had survived. If half their family had not been torn apart by betrayal. Grief and longing layered over each other, but there was no turning back the clock. Davos turned, his weathered face lined by torchlight. We all wish for what's lost. The present demands our strength. Jon simply nodded, The two men stood in the quiet, a silent vigil under the moon, listening to the cold wind stir the banner of the direwolf overhead. In the following days, word spread across the north that Winterfell was once again under Stark rule. The battered fortress saw arrivals trickling in, minor lords pledging fealty, hold-fast farmers delivering what little they could spare in gratitude. Petyr Baelish lingered at the edges of the gatherings, a ghost of a smile on his lips, presumably pleased with his role in turning the tide of the battle. Jon distrusted him innately, but recognized the precarious alliance. In the far corner of the yard, the Knights of the Vale made their presence known, continuing their drills, silver falcon crests gleaming in the pale light. Sansa watched Baelish with a careful eye, recalling the lines of cunning she had learned to read on his face. Yet for the moment, they needed each other. The Vale's strength had saved them, and their future might require more cooperation, unless they could secure a different alliance. One afternoon, Sansa entered the Great Hall and found Jon speaking in low tones with a messenger who had arrived from White Harbor. The man's face was pinched, worried lines carved by the cold. When he departed, Jon turned to Sansa, tension creasing his forehead. White Harbor has had no word from the Crown in months. The Manderless are uncertain what to do if a southern army marches up the King's Road. They ask for guidance, but I have none to give. Sansa regarded him quietly. We'll have to strengthen the Moat defenses. Once, it was near impregnable. If it's properly manned, no southern force can move north easily. She paused, tracing a finger along the table's grain. But what if there is no southern force? What if the Lannisters turn their attention elsewhere? Or if they've collapsed entirely? We can't remain ignorant. We need eyes in the south. We need to know who truly rules King's Landing now. Memchirar. Jon nodded solemnly. We'll send scouts, discreet ones, perhaps men who can travel swiftly and without drawing attention. She agreed, though her gaze flickered to the windows, as though searching beyond them for answers. The future was murky, each road branching in unknown directions. But one thing remained constant, the ever-present chill creeping into their bones, the unstoppable approach of a dark winter. Time passed, and with each day, Winterfell stirred more to life. Blacksmiths repaired broken gates, hammered swords for new recruits. The training yard rang with steel on steel as knights tested their mettle. In the great hall, stews bubbled in great pots. Servants fussed over a meager but steady supply of bread, salted meat, and tubers from the fields that had not yet withered under the frosts. Slowly, the castle reawakened under the stony guardianship of the Stark sigil. Jon spent his hours checking on the men, rallying them with quiet words of encouragement, or discussing with Tormund how best to integrate the wildlings among the northern soldiers without sparking too many tensions. Some houses still eyed the free folk warily, resentful or fearful of their presence. But Jon pressed them forward, reminding them that the real enemy wore no sigil at all. One cold morning, as Jon drilled with a group of young recruits in the yard, a raven arrived. The black bird perched on the maester's arm with a parchment tied to its leg. The note bore the seal of House Tyrell, an unexpected shift. Jon, Sansa, and Davos pored over the letter in private, gleaning that the Tyrells might stand opposed to the Lannisters after the catastrophe in King's Landing. Some rumor of a wildfire explosion, the death of many nobles, and the crowning of a new queen on the Iron Throne. The letter was cryptic, short, but it indicated the Tyrells might be seeking allies, perhaps even the North. Jon's stomach twisted. The idea of a southern alliance for a renewed Stark dominion felt like stepping onto a precarious ledge. He suspected Baelish would push him to exploit it, to seize an opportunity. But all Jon wanted was more men for the fight to come. More swords, more alliances, so that when the dead marched, the living could stand a chance. Could such an alliance be forged without entangling the North in further bloodshed? He braced himself for the next meeting of the Northern Lords, where he would have to mention this communication. The day was bright, sunlight glancing off the snow, and the lords gathered in the refurbished council chamber off the Great Hall. There, with Sansa at his right and Davos at his left, Jon opened the letter and read it aloud. Whispers rippled around the table. When he finished, Lord Glover lifted his head. "So, The Tyrells want to break from the Lannisters, do they? I suppose they blame Cersei Lannister for many ills, and perhaps they're right. But why should we trust them? Lord Manderley's emissary, a round-faced older man, considered carefully. In the past, House Tyrell fought under a different banner. They supported the Targaryens for years. Then they bent the knee to the Baratheons. They shift as the wind blows. Still, if they are the ruling power in the Reach, they have resources. Grain, horses, soldiers. Neptune. Lady Mormont folded her arms. We are the North. We owe the Reach nothing, nor do they owe us. I see the wisdom in forging alliances, but we must not become pawns in their squabbles. Jon eyed the group. If the Tyrells are serious, we could ask them for shipments of grain. That is what we need the most, along with more manpower to face the real threat. We can't fight the dead on empty stomachs. Sansa added, we must tread carefully though. If the Lannisters have truly lost their hold, new powers may try to claim the throne. The Tyrells might be only the first to send a raven. We need information, not just from them, but from all corners of the realm. The Targaryen queen across the sea, for instance. There are rumors of dragons and a massive army. This could become a war the likes of which we haven't seen in generations. A heavy silence fell over the lords as the enormity of her words sank in. War from the south, war from the north, a realm beset on all sides. Jon felt the pulse in his temples. The fate of countless lives weighed upon decisions made in this candlelit chamber. The memory of the battlefield near Winterfell was fresh. Dying men, screams, blood in the snow. He did not want to lead them into another endless conflict. Yet if they did nothing, the North could be overrun by whichever force arrived first, be it living or dead. Over the next few weeks, messages were exchanged. Polite inquiries to Highgarden, to Dorne, even to the Eyrie via Petyr Balish's connections. Jon found little solace in the flurry of parchments crossing the realm. The answers they received were circumspect, half political, half coded. Everyone sensed that the game was shifting rapidly. The Iron Throne was no longer a stable seat. It was a swirling vortex of power plays and ambitions. Some letters extended cautious hands of friendship. Others threatened retribution if the North tried to break away. Baelish, for his part, made subtle suggestions about how to navigate these waters. Jon listened, but kept his own counsel, aware that Baelish had agendas as veiled as winter skies. One dark evening, when torches illuminated the courtyard in flickering halos, Jon ventured to the crypts beneath Winterfell. He had scarcely set foot there since the battle, the grief over Rickon's death too near to bear. But the quiet gloom of the crypts drew him now, perhaps in the hope of finding answers among the dead. He carried a single lantern that cast a trembling light on the carved stone effigies of Stark ancestors. The air was damp and cold, smelling of ancient dust. He passed the resting place of his supposed father, Ned Stark, stopping briefly to bow his head in reverence. His chest ached with longing. Then he moved deeper until he found Rickon's new tomb, placed near where Robb might have been, had there been remains to bury. Rickon's effigy was simpler, newly carved by the castle's stonemason. A boy with a gentle, fearless expression, a direwolf curled at his feet. Jon's eye stung. "I'm sorry, Rickon," he said, voice echoing hollowly. "I should have saved you. I should have known." His words trembled in the heavy stillness. The crypt gave no reply, offering only the cold hush of centuries. Jon set the lantern down on a ledge. He knelt, one knee pressing against the stone floor. "I wanted you to see the North restored. I wanted you to run in the fields again like we did when we were children." He closed his eyes, memories flashing. Rickon's wide-eyed laughter, the boy's unbreakable bond with Shaggy Dog, the way Rickon used to cling to his older siblings whenever a storm raged outside. All of it was gone now, pinned under the final cruelty of Ramsay Bolton's arrow. He sensed movement behind him and glanced over his shoulder. Sansa stood at the foot of the steps, head bowed. "I thought I'd find you here," she said gently, her voice reverberating off the cold stone. Jon stood and turned. She drew closer, her cloak scraping the ground. "I still can't believe he's gone," she murmured. looking at the carved figure of their little brother. Tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them back. I think of him every morning, every night. Jon placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension and sorrow coiling there. I thought coming down here might offer some clarity. Remind me of why we're doing any of this. He sighed, glancing around at the sleeping stone faces of their ancestors. I keep wondering what Father would do, or Mother, or Robb, but they're not here. They aren't, Sansa said. But we are. And so we must make the choices they can't. She looked at Jon with determined eyes. We've reclaimed Winterfell, but the lords are pushing you toward a bigger throne. Some are calling you king in the north, but there are whispers of more. If there's a southern power vacuum, they wonder if the north might not only defend itself, but finally press for the ultimate seat. Jon's stomach tightened. I have no desire to sit on the Iron Throne. It's a pit of vipers. I only ever took command out of necessity. She pressed her lips together. I know. But in the Game of Thrones, reluctance can be as dangerous as ambition. If people believe you're a contender, they'll come for you whether you want it or not. She hesitated. Perhaps we can use that to our advantage, form alliances that give us the resources we need to face what's coming. Jon turned away, gazing at the stone figures. We stand on precarious ground, Sansa. Even if we marched south, that would leave the north exposed to the real enemy. We can't fight on two fronts. We must hold the north, gather allies, and prepare. She nodded, though the flicker in her eyes showed doubt. So we claim neutrality? Or do we lead the north into open defiance of the Iron Throne? Either path could bring the Lannisters or their next puppet bearing down on us. Or, if it's truly Cersei Lannister on the throne, the vengeance of a scorned queen is nothing to dismiss lightly. Then Miss Yuan. Jon felt the weight of her words. We can't remain silent. We have to make it clear that the North will not kneel to a tyrant. But we also can't declare open war unless there's no other choice. He paused, taking a steadying breath. We need a plan. We'll gather the houses, see who's truly loyal. We'll build up Moat Cailin. We'll send envoys south to glean more truths. If necessary, we'll send small contingents to treat with the Tyrells, or even with this Daenerys Targaryen, if she truly has dragons. But first and foremost, we make the North stronger than it's ever been. Now, Sansa nodded, her hand brushing Rickon's effigy in a silent goodbye. They turned to leave together, guided by the lantern's uncertain glow. The darkness of the crypts receded behind them, but the chill lingered in their bones. Each step reminded them of the burdens they now carried, as the heirs of Winterfell, as potential leaders in a realm on the brink of cataclysm. In the moonlit courtyard, the night watchmen made their rounds with torches, the sound of their boots crunching in thin snow. Sansa drew her cloak closer around her and looked up at Jon. I know you feel lost, so do I. But we have each other. We must trust that together we'll find the right path. Jon placed a hand on her shoulder. We will. For Rickon, for Robb, for all who have fallen. He glanced up at the high towers of Winterfell, the proud walls that had stood for countless generations. A small part of him wondered if the next generation of Starks would survive this war. If perhaps, when the snows finally melted, a new spring might dawn on the castle. They parted ways with a quiet understanding. Jon ascended the stone steps to his chambers, exhaustion weighing him down, yet a strange ember of resolve kept him upright. He remembered crossing into the far north, seeing those shimmering lights of the aurora flicker over the haunted forest, feeling that creeping dread in his gut. That dread was with him still. A sense that something beyond mortal comprehension was stirring. But he had changed since those days, a new sense of destiny, a heavier burden, and an inexplicable second chance at life. He thought of what would happen if the North truly named him king. Would the realm rally behind him against the dead, or would it tear itself apart in a scramble for power? For so long, he had tried to escape the label of bastard, to be recognized as someone worthy of respect. Now, ironically, the realm might ask him to wear a crown. The notion felt surreal, like a dream he might have on a stormy night. Sleep, when it came, was far from gentle. Jon dreamed of ravens flying across a black sky, each with eyes of bright blue flame. He dreamed of a throne made of ice, spiked with the bones of the fallen. He dreamed of a dragon flying over the battlements of Winterfell, scorching the ground to ash. He saw the dead walk in silent ranks, unstoppable, blotting out the horizon. And in the midst of the swirling chaos, a single figure with flaming eyes reached out to him, commanding him to kneel. Jon awoke, drenched in sweat, heart hammering like a wild drum. Dawn's first rays crept across the sky, indifferent to the nightmares that plagued him. He dressed quickly, pulling on furs and leathers, seeking refuge in the morning's routine. In the yard, men trained. He joined them, letting the clash of steel and the grind of footwork drive away lingering echoes of his dream. Tormund barked instructions to a younger wildling, correcting his stance with characteristic bluntness. Nearby, a handful of Stark guards tested newly forged pikes, adjusting grips and angles. Jon spent hours in practice, the movement of sword and shield a comfort, a reminder of simpler times when all that mattered was survival on the battlefield. Even so, the swirl of questions in his mind never fully quieted. Every so often he'd see a northern soldier bow his head and mutter, "Your Grace or King Jon," and a prickle of discomfort ran through him. He had to find a way to use this unwanted mantle for good, or else the realm, and the North, would be lost to threats both mortal and otherwise. Late that night, after the day's labors, Jon found himself alone in the godswood. Snow drifted softly around the sacred heart tree, red leaves trembling like old wounds. The carved face on the trunk seemed to stare at him, eyes weeping sap as though in eternal sorrow. Jon thought back to his conversation with Sansa D. His father, his uncle, truly, had once prayed under a heart tree, seeking guidance. Could Jon do the same? He felt no special kinship to the old gods or the new, but some quiet corner of his soul yearned for an answer. He knelt on the cold ground, ignoring the chill that crept into his bones. The swirling wind tugged at his hair. His breath clouded before him, dispersing into the night. But the gods, if they listened, offered him no words. The only sound was the hush of branches in the breeze and the faint gurgling of the godswood pool, partially frozen under the winter's grip. When he rose, frost clung to his knees. Yet a certain heaviness had lifted from his chest, replaced by the subtle threads of purpose weaving through him again. He could not walk away from this. The North needed him. The realm might need him too, whether he wanted to be its king or not. If a crown was the price to rally men for the war against the dead, then he would bear it. If forging alliances with strangers in the South was necessary to gather grain and arms, he would do it. He would do anything to ensure fewer graves were dug in the northern snows. Thus, in the silent midnight hush of the godswood, Jon Snow made a choice. If his people called him king, then he would act as one. If there was a path leading ever south toward an iron throne, half in ruin, he would walk it on his own terms, to bring the living together, to shield them from the horror that haunted his dreams. The old gods offered no direct reply, but in the rustle of leaves, Jon thought he heard a faint whisper of acceptance, like the sigh of an ancient sentinel. In the days to come, he would speak plainly to the gathered lords, to Sansa, and to Davos. He would speak of forging alliances, mustering the North, fortifying Moat, and sending envoys to see if any queen in the South, Cersei or Daenerys, had the sense to ally against the coming darkness. He would risk the precarious labyrinth of politics for the sake of preserving life. And maybe, just maybe, the realm would listen. Or perhaps it would spin out of control, hungry for war, ignoring the true peril until it was too late. Such were the unspoken vows in Jon Snow's heart as he left the godswood. Snow drifting from the branches overhead, the quiet hush of Winterfell surrounded him, the ancient stones steeped in memory. He paced back toward the castle, where the flickering torches by the gate guided him forward. High above, the night sky shimmered with distant stars. Somewhere beyond those stars, a truth might lie hidden, some measure of hope. But until it revealed itself, he would stand, as his so-called father did before him, for the North and for all the living who needed him. He paused, just for a moment, on the threshold of the courtyard. The wind carried with it the scent of pine and the distant tang of smoke. He gazed upward at the looming towers of Winterfell, feeling the vast legacy that pressed upon him. If he was to be king in the north, he would be a king unlike any other. A leader not seeking personal glory but a single aim: to unite the living against the gathering storm. With that solemn vow echoing in his mind, he stepped under the archway and back into the heart of the fortress. Inside, Sansa waited, the faint lines of exhaustion etched on her face. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw the calm resolve he had found among the weirwood's silent watchers. Wordlessly, they acknowledged the road that stretched before them. Tomorrow would bring another council, another series of decisions. War might be imminent, or delayed by the cunning of the southern lords. But no matter what came, Jon Snow would not retreat. He would shoulder the mantle thrust upon him, if it meant a fighting chance for those who placed their faith in him. His footsteps carried him deeper into the corridors of Winterfell, the flickering torchlight dancing on his cloak. The ancient stones whispered of the past, but Jon Snow's mind churned with the future. He embraced the chill, the echoes of the castle, and the burdens of the crown he neither sought nor truly refused. If claiming that throne, or at least its promise, meant survival for the North, so be it. Let the realm call him what they wished. The White Wolf, a bastard king, the embodiment of Ned Stark's honor. In the end, titles mattered little. Only duty remained, pulsing in his veins like a living thing. Duty to the North, to his family, to every living soul who deserved more than the jaws of death. And so, on that night, the first steps toward a destiny greater than he had ever foreseen were quietly taken in the hushed corridors of Winterfell. The unspoken echoes of the battles won, and the greater battles yet to come, resonated through the walls. Winter was no longer coming. It was here. And with it, the question that would shape the fate of Westeros. Would Jon Snow, king in the north, stand alone, or would he rise to claim the Iron Throne itself, forging a shield for all mankind? The winds of winter howled softly outside, as though urging him onward, into the uncertain darkness of what lay ahead. Kaya, Gay. A crisp morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, tipping the snow-caked stones with a pale glow. Newly pledged soldiers drilled with swords still bearing fresh nicks from the Battle of the Bastards. The scrape of steel echoed off the high walls. A few battered shields were propped against a post, waiting to be repaired or replaced. Over the last few weeks, the lull in open warfare had allowed Winterfell to begin its slow healing. But the air remained tense with the knowledge that their struggles were far from over. Jon stood on the steps leading down into the courtyard, cloaked in heavy furs, his breath curling faintly in the morning chill. The activity of the castle spread before him. Stable hands wrestled restless horses into harnesses, while grooms checked saddles and feed bags. A line of servants in threadbare cloaks carried baskets of turnips, onions, and dried beans from the storerooms toward the great hall. Each load was carefully counted. There wasn't an abundance to spare. The north had been ravaged by Bolton misrule and the savage winter that crept deeper each day. As he watched, Sansa approached from the side, her steps almost silent on the frosty flagstones. Her hair was pinned back, an elegant veil of red framing her pale cheeks. She greeted him with a measured nod before turning her gaze to the bustle of the courtyard. They had grown closer since reclaiming Winterfell, forging a bond tempered by necessity and mutual respect. Yet something weighed on them both, the knowledge that the real fight lay far beyond the castle walls. "Are the envoys ready?" Jon asked quietly, mindful that prying ears might linger nearby. Sansa glanced behind her. Two riders in plain leather tunics, men of quiet competence, stood by their horses. They were to head south, through the Neck, and into the Riverlands, carrying carefully penned missives to houses that might offer support. "They are," Sansa confirmed. "They'll ride at first light tomorrow. If the roads haven't frozen too deeply, they might reach the Twins without delay." Jon let out a breath. The idea of going anywhere near the Twins revived a flicker of old bitterness. Once, the phrase had betrayed Robb Stark, resulting in the Red Wedding that had torn the family apart. "It's a risk," he murmured. "But we need answers. Whether it's news of the Lannisters or the Tyrells, or any changes at the seat of power, we must know what the rest of Westeros is doing." Sansa folded her arms. the soft fur of her cloak brushing against his. Agreed. And if the Freys take offense that we're riding through their territory, then let them. We cannot cower in the north. We need to see what alliances might still stand or be formed. Napercento. His eyes settled on her for a moment, and he caught the determined line of her jaw. In a subtle movement, he laid a hand on her shoulder, grateful for her steadiness. Then, with a tight nod, he moved down into the courtyard, wending his way between men sparring in the practice yard. Tormund Giantsbane was there, arms folded across his broad chest, barking corrections at a group of young wildlings and northerners who struggled to train side by side. One young man, a freckled lad from House Serwyn, had stepped wrong and nearly taken a wildling's blade to the ribs, protected only by a hastily angled wooden shield. Tormund let out a roar that rattled a nearby raven into flight. You keep your eyes on the blade, boy. He's not your friend when you're crossing steel. Know that, and you might live another day. Davos. The lad stumbled back, chest heaving, while the wildling opposite him rolled his shoulders with an impatient scowl. Jon stepped closer, clearing his throat. Tormund, he called, drawing the man's attention. How goes the training? About as well as I'd expect from a bunch of green boys and squeamish southerners. He spat, though not with malice. They'll learn, but it won't be quick. War is one thing. Discipline is another. Jon nodded. We keep drilling. Winter is here, and we'll need every sword to hold the line. He paused, watching how the group tried to maintain formation. Show them how to fight as one unit, not just as individuals. The army of the dead doesn't break ranks. We have to match that determination. A few yards away, the old blacksmith, now aided by two burly apprentices, hammered at a reworked blade, sparks flying in bright arcs. The sharp tang of heated metal filled the air. The ring of steel on steel was constant, reminding Jon of the forging that needed to happen, not just with weapons, but among the people themselves. He caught sight of Lady Mormont, that small, formidable presence of a girl, observing from the edge of the yard. Wrapped in a thick cloak, she surveyed the training with sharp-eyed curiosity. Jon approached, greeting her with a polite bow of his head. She nodded in return, lips pressed tight. King Jon, she said, her expression serious. I'd hoped to see more progress. The men are tired. We've come through a brutal fight, but more is needed if we're to stand against the next threat. He gave a wry half-smile at her frankness. We're doing what we can. The North has been through too much already. Baradin? She frowned, dark eyes flicking to a pair of soldiers practicing on straw dummies. We do what must be done, but you should know something. Some of my men who patrol the outskirts near the Dreadfort say they've seen riders passing in the dead of night. Could be Bolton remnants, or perhaps just brigands taking advantage of the chaos. We can't be sure. Jon felt the familiar tension coil in his gut. The Boltons might be gone as a ruling house, but it seemed they had not been wholly eliminated. We'll send a few scouting parties, he said, and if necessary we'll root them out. Lady Mormont lifted her chin in acknowledgement. Good. Let them know House Mormont stands ready to aid. I won't let any of those traitorous curs fester in the north. Their conversation ended as the clang of a bell signaled that midday had arrived. The men paused their training, and some of the senior knights ushered the younger recruits toward the great hall for a meal. Jon excused himself, heading the other way, seeking a moment of reprieve in the library tower. By now, the old library had been partially restored. Where before Bolton men had scattered or burned records, the remaining volumes had been salvaged from dusty corners. A few fresh sets of parchment and ink were stacked around the reading tables, a sign that Sansa and the castle stewards were attempting to re-establish order. He stepped inside, greeted by the smell of leather bindings and the soft hush of pages turning. Davos Seaworth sat at a table near a narrow window, squinting at a parchment under the meager daylight that filtered through frosted glass. He looked up, a slight smile tugging at his beard. Lord Snow, he greeted, though there was a playful note in his voice. Or King, or whichever title we're using today. Jon shook his head with a half-smile, taking a seat across from Davos. You know I'd prefer you just call me Jon. Not sure that'll fly with the proud lords of the North, Davos said gently. He tapped the parchment, his expression turning serious. I've been reading reports from Eastwatch by the sea. It seems the wildlings stationed there spotted more whites near the coast. Small bands, perhaps stray from the main horde. But it's clear they're on the move. No. Jon swallowed hard. The notion of the undead wandering the far north coastline was chilling. How many? Not many, but enough to remind us that we can't ignore them. We need to rally more men to the wall. His grim tone left no room for doubt. If the stories are true, if they can breach the wall or find a way around it, then it's only a matter of time before they pour into the Seven Kingdoms. Jon leaned back, fighting a surge of helplessness. We haven't the numbers to garrison the entire length of it. Even if we did, it might not be enough. The army of the dead is massive. Demimau. Davos nodded, expression heavy. Aye. That's the rub of it. We can't fight them with swords alone. Maybe dragonglass from Dragonstone, if the tales hold truth. Or something more mystical. But forging alliances is key. If we stand alone in the north, we'll be overrun. Jon rubbed a hand over his face. We have to convince the rest of Westeros that the threat is real. And time is short. Davos shifted his chair, looking around the library's half-filled shelves. Once upon a time, knowledge might have carried the day. Now, we scramble to rebuild libraries and archives destroyed by war. We have scraps of knowledge but no united front. Still, he reached for a small scroll. I found a fragment of an old record. It's from the Long Night. Tells of how the first men and the children of the forest united to beat back the darkness. We have to do the same. Jon's jaw tightened. We will. If I have to kneel to a southern ruler just to get them to send men, so be it. He paused, recalling the swirl of rumors about Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons, or Cersei Lannister and her rumored cunning. But we have no guarantee any queen, Lannister or Targaryen, will listen. And if the Tyrells want to break free of the crown, that's another front entirely. Davos slipped the scroll aside. One step at a time. Sansa's envoys may bring back news. In the meantime, we keep building our strength here. Winterfell has always been a symbol of stark resilience. Let's make sure it stands for more than just the North this time. Jon gave a nod, feeling a subtle flicker of resolve in the midst of so much uncertainty. He rose, leaving Davos to his reading, and stepped back into the corridor. The hall was dimly lit by torches in iron brackets, tapestries swaying in the draught. He made for the great hall, expecting a working lunch of sorts, and the clamor of voices reached him even before he pushed open the tall doors. Inside, the fires in the hearth crackled, lending a momentary feeling of warmth. Several tables had been arranged at the sides, laden with wooden bowls of thick stew, trenchers of bread, and pitchers of ale. Soldiers and minor lords alike gathered in small knots, talking in subdued tones. Sansa was present, seated at the high table with Lady Mormont and Lord Glover, deep in conversation. When she spotted Jon, she waved him over, and the others fell silent, waiting for him to settle before they continued. Glover's face bore the lines of a man perpetually worried. He rubbed a hand over his trimmed beard. We've had a raven from White Harbor. Word has it that a small fleet arrived there, merchant ships from across the narrow sea. They bring tales of dragons in Essos. They claim these beasts have laid waste to slave cities, liberating them under some Targaryen queen. Dao. Sansa fixed her cool gaze on Lord Glover. We heard rumors of that queen, Daenerys Targaryen, intending to cross the sea and claim the Iron Throne. If she commands dragons, that might shift the entire balance of power. He grunted. Or shift the realm into chaos. If she flies north with fire and blood, I doubt she'd treat us kindly if we don't bend the knee. Sansa flicked her eyes to Jon. He remained quiet a moment, absorbing the new puzzle piece. This queen might be more open to alliances than the Lannisters, he offered. If she's gone to the trouble of freeing slaves, perhaps she's not as cruel as some. We don't know enough, but we cannot afford to be caught off guard. Lady Mormont, hands clasped on the table, spoke up. We must be wary, but not paralyzed by fear. If this Targaryen truly has dragons, it could mean everything in the fight against the White Walkers. Fire is the ancient enemy of ice. Glover's lips thinned. True enough. But the Targaryens once used dragons to subdue the entire continent. We could end up as a province of a foreign queen if we're not careful. Rush. Jon met the man's gaze. If she's wise, she'll see we have bigger problems than petty conquest. The army of the dead won't care whose sigil is raised above our walls. He noticed how Sansa's posture straightened, and the flicker in her eyes told him she was thinking of the next move. Let's see if we can glean more information. White Harbor might have further news if we send a loyal emissary. Lord Glover exhaled, resignation in his tone. We can arrange that. They returned to their stew and bread, though the conversation was weighed down by looming threats. Outside, the winter day gradually dimmed, until torchlight replaced the watery sun. Jon spent much of that evening in council with Sansa, Davos, and a handful of loyal lords, drafting letters and discussing the best routes for their envoys. At some point past midnight, he found himself in the old solar that once belonged to Ned Stark, hunched over a map of Westeros, eyes bleary with exhaustion. He traced the coastline with a fingertip. The craggy outline of the north, the vast sea that separated them from Essos, the southern expanse that led to King's Landing. Everything felt impossibly far apart, connected only by tenuous alliances or stifled rivalries. He imagined the unstoppable tide of whites pouring over the wall, sweeping away villages and holdfasts, reducing each proud house to a memory. The sharp sense of dread set his heart racing. Sansa touched his shoulder gently, her face lined with worry. "You should rest, Jon." He shook his head. "I can't, not yet. There's too much to plan." "Ninabal." She pulled a small stool beside him, lowering her voice. "We have done all we can for tonight. You'll only wear yourself down if you continue like this." In her eyes, he could see genuine concern. "We need you strong." He yielded to that logic, though it felt like giving up a battle. Closing the map, he let out a weary breath. "All right. In the morning, we'll finalize the letters to White Harbor, to Bear Island, to the Vale. We'll see if the Tyrells have responded by then." She nodded and rose, offering him a hand. They left the solar together, footsteps echoing along corridors lit by flickering wall sconces. When they reached the intersection where their chambers lay in opposite directions, they parted without another word, an unspoken agreement that the burden they carried was shared. Jon entered his chamber to find the fire reduced to embers in the hearth. Stripping off his cloak, he tossed it over a chair and knelt to stir the coals until they flared to life once more. The sudden warmth against his hands reminded him he was still among the living, that the nightmares of the White Walkers were at least a day's ride away. Yet in his heart, he felt that the distance offered no true safety. He crawled into bed, silent and alone, and let the black tide of sleep claim him. Dawn came all too soon. Messengers departed Winterfell with sealed letters, carefully directed to lords who might lend an ear or supply more men. Jon oversaw each departure, offering quiet words of caution. More than one messenger might vanish in the cold roads or at the hands of outlaws if they were unlucky. The tension was as thick as the falling snow. Still, the possibility of forging alliances drove them onward. Tormund insisted on leading a scouting party north to Last Hearth, to ensure the Umbers still loyal to the Starks had not been overrun by wandering whites. Jon allowed it, trusting Tormund's judgment. Before the big wildling departed, Jon clasped his arm in a firm farewell. Tormund's grin was a wild slash across his weathered face. "Don't go calling yourself king in the north without me around, you hear?" he teased. "I want to see the look on everyone's face when you do." Jon offered him the faintest smile. "I'll save that pleasure for you, Tormund. But be careful." With a boisterous laugh, Tormund led his handful of men out of the courtyard. Jon watched them go until the silhouette of their horses vanished into the swirling snowfall. Afterward, he turned back to face the fortress, trying to chase away the uneasy sense that trouble lurked just beyond the walls. Inside the great hall, Lord Glover arrived in a rush, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Jon," he said, inclining his head, "we've captured a Bolton deserter skulking near an abandoned village. Claims he was forced to fight for Ramsay, but we found him with a knife coated in fresh blood. Seems he's been thieving, perhaps worse." Jon's eyes narrowed. "Where is he?" "In the dungeons." Glover's tone turned grim. He's asking to speak with you. Thinks he can bargain for his life. Jon felt a flicker of old anger tighten around his chest. Memories of the Battle of the Bastards flashed in his mind. Bolton men jeering, the loyalists crushed between ranks of shields, Rickon's body in the snow. He forced the memory back. Take me to him. They descended into the depths of Winterfell, torches casting wavering shadows across damp stone walls. The dungeons were sparse, a reminder that the Boltons had used far harsher spaces for imprisonment. A pair of guards flanked a heavy wooden door. One guard bowed curtly as Jon and Glover approached, pushing open the door to reveal a cramped cell. Inside, the man crouched on a pile of straw. His dark hair hung in ragged clumps, and his eyes darted nervously as Jon entered. The flickering torchlight revealed a sallow face, etched with desperation. As soon as he recognized Jon, the prisoner scrambled upright, pressing himself against the bars. "My lord," he hissed, voice hoarse. "I didn't want to serve Ramsay. He killed my brothers, forced me to fight. I had no choice." Jon kept his voice level. "You had a choice once Ramsay was defeated." The man wet his lips. I tried to leave. Didn't want no more bloodshed. But the roads were dangerous. There were men after me. I couldn't." Glover's hand twitched on the hilt of his sword. Jon noticed but said nothing. He locked eyes with the prisoner. "You murdered and stole. That's what Lord Glover's men say." The prisoner's gaze flicked away. "I took what I needed to survive. They'd have killed me otherwise. Please, I'll tell you things. Secrets. Ramsay had men stashed in certain places. Not all of them are dead. They might try to join forces with someone else." Jon's jaw tightened. He knew well enough that some Bolton men would prefer to hide and wait for a chance at vengeance. "Tell us," he said simply, though he didn't promise mercy. The prisoner licked his cracked lips. "Near the ruins of Deepwood Moat, there's a small camp. A handful of them. Enough to cause trouble. And they've been in contact with some foreigners. Sellswords, I think." Glover stiffened at the mention of Deepwood Moat, his seat. "You lie," he growled, eyes flashing. "My sister's men patrol that area." "I swear," the prisoner said, raising grimy hands. "They come and go under the cover of night. They know the old forest paths." Jon turned to Glover. "We'll send our own men to verify." Then he faced the prisoner again. "If this proves true, you might have a chance at clemency, but you'll remain in these cells until we know you aren't lying." The man sagged in relief, though there was little comfort in his posture. Jon stepped away, turning on his heel as the guards shut the door behind him with a clang. Glover's face was a mask of controlled fury. "If any Bolton men remain near Deepwood Moat, I want them dealt with. No mercy." Jon met his gaze. "Agreed. But we can't send too many. Our forces are stretched thin." Glover growled. "I'll lead them myself if I must." They parted in the corridor, Glover's frustration evident as he stalked up the steps. Jon lingered for a moment, the torch flickering against the cold stone. Even as they tried to secure alliances in the south, old enemies in the north might be sowing chaos. There were never enough men to address all threats. Sighing, he followed Glover upstairs, the winding staircase lit by sputtering torches, until he emerged into the main corridor of the castle. He found Sansa waiting at the top. She took one look at his expression and frowned. "What is it this time?" He relayed what the prisoner had said about Bolton loyalists near Deepwood Moat. Sansa's gaze flickered with anxiety. "They must be mad. They have no resources, no legitimate claim now that Ramsay is dead." "Desperate men can still be dangerous," Jon replied. "If they gather others, or if they find a new benefactor, they could cause trouble at our rear while we focus elsewhere. We can't let them fester." Sansa nodded firmly. "Then we go. Or we send enough men to show them they have no future in the north." Jon mulled that over. "Glover wants to handle it personally, but I don't like the idea of losing him if it turns into a trap. We'll form a small detachment, just enough to root out the threat quietly. We can't spare a whole army." "Agreed," Sansa said. "We can't have our attention divided with so many other issues at hand." That very night, a group of stout warriors from House Glover, accompanied by a handful of seasoned wildlings, departed Winterfell. They rode under cover of darkness, heavily cloaked against the cold, determined to locate and eliminate the Bolton loyalists. Glover himself led them, face grimly set against the wind. Jon watched from the ramparts as the small column of riders vanished into the swirling snow, torches bobbing like fireflies in the distance. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Winterfell shifted again. Word of the Bolton deserter spread quietly, fueling speculation that more pockets of Ramsay's men might be lurking. The guard doubled their patrols around the castle walls, and rumors twisted in the corners of the Great Hall. Some insisted the Boltons had hidden caches of food and weapons throughout the north. Others believed foreign sellswords had been hired to reclaim the castle. Each rumor added to the tension, weaving an air of foreboding. Amid the swirl of dire speculation, one bright note arrived in the form of a raven from White Harbor. Sansa and Jon read it together in the privacy of the solar. It bore the seal of House Manderley, and its contents offered a glimmer of potential. The Manderleys had opened cautious negotiations with merchants from Essos who claimed to represent buyers interested in establishing trade routes for grain and salted fish. While no direct mention of the Targaryen queen was made, it hinted that these merchants had connections to powerful figures across the sea. If we could negotiate for dragonglass through these intermediaries, Jon began, a spark of hope in his eyes. Sansa set the parchment aside. It might be the start of something, but we need to confirm their legitimacy. Manderley says these merchants seem honest, but coin often obscures true intentions. Jon nodded slowly. Still, it's worth exploring. We can't produce dragonglass ourselves. If these contacts can lead us to someone who can, that could be decisive in the war to come. 9. Sansa began drafting a response at once, her quill scratching across the parchment. She wrote carefully, diplomatically, weaving together the threads of courtesy, caution, and opportunity. Jon watched her for a moment. The warmth of the small brazier by the desk painted shadows on her face, and he felt a flicker of gratitude that she was there, carrying half the load. Outside, a fresh snowfall coated the walls, and the winter sky looked leaden, heavy with the promise of more. Servants trudged through the courtyard, clearing walkways, hauling firewood. Each day bled into the next, the dark closing in ever faster as winter tightened its icy grip. Men from various northern houses came to pledge loyalty or to express concerns, each with a fresh worry: bandits diminishing grain supplies, rumors of the Night's Watch sightings of the dead. Jon listened, delegated, tried to keep a steady course, but it felt like bailing water from a ship riddled with holes. They needed more hands, more time, more everything. One late afternoon, as the feeble sun clung to the horizon, a rider approached Winterfell with the banners of the Eyrie snapping behind him. Word passed swiftly through the gates, and Jon, along with Sansa and Davos, gathered in the courtyard to meet this messenger. The man dismounted in a swirl of cloak and introduced himself as Sir Wullan, a messenger of Lord Petyr Baelish, though Baelish was already within the castle walls, which made this arrival curious. Sir Wullan bowed, his breath fogging in the cold. "My lords, my lady, I bring word from the Vale." Jon exchanged a glance with Sansa, who looked as puzzled as he felt. "Speak," she said. He cleared his throat. "Lord Royce has received troubling news from the mountain clans near the Bloody Gate. They've seen Lannister scouts approaching. It seems the Queen and King's Landing may have designs on preventing any northern expansion. They might be testing the Vale's defenses." Davos swore under his breath. Sansa's eyes narrowed. "Cersei wastes no time, does she?" she said, voice laced with quiet anger. "She sees threat in every direction, apparently." Jon asked calmly, "Does Lord Royce expect war? Or is this just a scouting party?" Sir Wullan shifted uncomfortably. "Unclear, my lord, but he advises caution. The Vale has pledged men to defend Winterfell should the Lannisters push north. However, he wants to be certain we stand united with him, and not solely reliant on Lord Baelish's own maneuverings." Sansa cast a quick look around. Petyr Baelish was nowhere to be seen in the courtyard, which only heightened the sense of secrecy about this message. "We'll send a reply," she said. "Thank you, Sir Wullan. Warm yourself inside. We'll speak further once you've rested." The knight bowed and led his horse toward the stables. Jon turned to Sansa and Davos. If the Lannisters are probing the Vale's defenses, that means they might already plan to move north, or at least threaten us into submission. Sansa's expression grew distant. Cersei knows the North is no longer under her sphere of influence. We've defied the crown in retaking Winterfell. She might see us as traitors that need to be brought to heel. She let out a breath, eyes flicking to Jon. We must stay on guard. One wrong move and we'll have Lannister armies at our gates. No, why? Davos inclined his head. Then forging alliances becomes all the more urgent. We can't hold off both the Lannisters and the army of the dead alone. They retreated inside, a cold tension settling over them like a shroud. Jon felt as though each day layered more weight onto his shoulders. Every new rumor or message wove into a tapestry of threats that threatened to engulf the North. The faint hope that the realm would unify in the face of the undead felt ever more distant. As evening set in, Sansa convened a smaller council in the library tower. A modest fire crackled in the hearth, though the chill still prowled at the edges of the room. Davos, Lady Mormont, Lord Cerwyn, and a smattering of other local lords crowded around a broad oak table. Sansa sat at the head with Jon to her right. Candles illuminated maps spread before them. We have word that the Lannisters may be eyeing the Vale, Sansa said, summarizing Sir Wayland's report. In the south, King's Landing is in turmoil. In the far north, the dead stir. The Bolton remnants haunt our outskirts. We are pressed on all sides. Negarton. Lady Mormont surveyed the map. If the Vale is threatened, that means the Knights of the Vale might be reluctant to leave their own borders to aid us further. Our victory over the Boltons was due in large part to their cavalry. Without them, we are significantly weaker. Lord Cerwyn, rubbing his temples, added, we could muster perhaps 5,000 men if we call all loyal houses, but not all are in a position to leave their lands. Many have been ravaged by war or the Boltons' deprivations. Jon interjected, we must first ensure the North is secure. That means rooting out any Bolton loyalists, ensuring Moat is well guarded, and forging a supply line with White Harbor. Until we're certain the North won't implode, we can't commit men outside our borders. Sansa nodded, scanning the faces around the table. Agreed, but we also can't ignore the Vale. If the Vale falls, the road north is open to the Lannisters, or to any other southern power who sees weakness in us. Davos tapped a finger on the table. Perhaps a contingent of experienced soldiers could ride to the Bloody Gate, not as a full army, but as a show of support. The Vale Lords might appreciate the gesture, and it could deter a small Lannister force from pressing forward. A murmur of agreement rose. Sansa made a note on a scrap of parchment. Jon pondered the plan, weighing the cost. We can spare maybe 300 men, enough to show unity with the Vale, not enough to leave us vulnerable. We'll have to coordinate with Lord Royce. Sansa looked at him, a hint of relief in her expression. Then it settled. We'll send a detachment soon. Lord Cerwyn, can you organize that? Cerwyn nodded slowly. I'll gather volunteers and some from House Tallheart perhaps. We'll ride within the week. The meeting stretched late into the night, each decision more fraught than the last. A ripple of exhaustion crossed the room as they concluded, but a sense of direction had been carved out of the chaos. Jon helped Sansa gather the maps and notes, and they lingered by the fire while the others shuffled out, discussing final details in hushed voices. When the last lord had departed, leaving only Sansa, Jon, and Davos, a quiet lull settled. Davos rubbed his hands near the fire. We do what we can, one crisis at a time. He managed a small, weary smile. Better than no plan at all. Jon's thoughts returned to the scouting party Glover had taken, and the possibility of trouble at Deepwood Moat. I hope Glover's men find nothing but rumors, he said, half to himself. Davos offered a reassuring nod. We'll hear soon enough. Sansa reached for a carafe of mulled wine and poured a small cup for each of them. The spiced aroma wafted through the air, offering a momentary comfort. To the north, she said, raising her cup. And all we're trying to protect. They drank in a subdued toast, no one voicing the deeper worries that churned beneath. Still, the warmth of the wine seemed to momentarily soften the edge of dread. Jon clung to that fleeting sense of camaraderie as they parted ways, stepping out into the corridor where a guard stood watch, torch sputtering in the cold draft. Alone again, Jon found himself drifting toward the godswood. Passing under an archway, he could see the ancient heart tree ahead, the carved face seeming to watch him. Snow piled in drifts around the roots, and the small pool shimmered with a thin film of ice. He stood there listening to the hush of night. The recollection of his oath to defend the living coursed through him, weighed by the fresh knowledge that old grudges and new ambitions might tear the realm apart, even before the dead arrived. Somewhere deep in the castle, a raven croaked. Wind rattled the bare branches overhead. Jon closed his eyes, as though the old gods might speak in the silence. He thought of all that hung in the balance. The family he had regained, the uneasy alliances, the threat of the dead. In that tranquil moment, he acknowledged both his fear and his resolve. There was no turning back from the path he walked, no respite from the mantle he had inherited. He opened his eyes. The frozen leaves rustled, red against pale bark. If there was comfort, it lay in the knowledge that he was not alone. Sansa was with him, Davos too, and Lady Mormont, and even Tormund in his unrefined way. Thousands of men and women who believed in him, or at least believed in the Stark name, stood behind him. Maybe that was enough to tip the scales. When he finally left the godswood, the moon was high and bright, outlining Winterfell's towers in silver light. He trudged through fresh snow, breath clouding around him. The walls seemed to loom larger in the moonlight, silent guardians of an ancestral legacy that now rested on his shoulders. Inside, torches guided him back to his chamber, where he sank onto the bed, mind still churning with 1,000 questions. Sleep did not come easily. He kept recalling the prisoner's words about Bolton men near Deepwood Moat, or the Lannister scouts near the Vale, or the rumored dragons across the sea. Each threat vied for attention, each needing urgent response. But eventually, exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he fell into a restless doze, populated by half-formed nightmares. Blue-eyed corpses reaching for him across a battlefield of snow and ice. At dawn, a jolt woke him. Someone was knocking on his chamber door. He stumbled out of bed, pulling on a cloak. When he opened the door, a wide-eyed guard stood there, panting. "My lord, a rider has come from Lord Glover." "He's wounded, but he brings urgent news." Jon's heart lurched. He motioned for the guard to lead the way. Grabbing his sword belt, he raced down the corridor. Sansa, roused by the commotion, joined him, her expression tense. They descended the steps 2 at a time until they reached the courtyard. Men gathered around a single rider slumped in the saddle, blood staining his furs. Jon hurried forward, helping the man dismount. The soldier's face was ashen, and he clutched a bandaged arm. "What happened?" Jon demanded, voice sharp with worry. The soldier gasped for breath. "Attacked. Near Deepwood Moat. They were waiting in the trees. Archers. We lost men. Lord Glover was struck. We barely escaped." Sansa pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with alarm. Jon gripped the man's shoulders, steadying him. "Is Glover alive? Where is he?" The soldier coughed, wincing with pain. Last I saw he was breathing. He ordered us to fall back. Send word to Winterfell. They have a larger force than we expected. Maybe 30 or 40 men. Bolton loyalists. Some foreign sellswords. We couldn't break them. Nah. Jon felt an icy dread coil in his gut. So the rumor was true. And worse than they'd feared. "Get him to the maester," he told the guards. "Now." The men hustled the wounded soldier inside, supporting him as he nearly collapsed. Sansa exhaled shakily, voice low. "They have Lord Glover pinned down. We have to help him." Jon's jaw set in determination. "We can't abandon our allies. Prepare a rescue force. I'll lead it myself." She grabbed his arm, eyes fierce. "I'm coming with you." He hesitated, about to argue, then saw the steel in her gaze. "All right," he said quietly. "But we leave soon. We can't let them regroup." Chaos exploded as men scrambled to ready horses, gather weapons, and assemble provisions. Snow fell harder now, blanketing the courtyard. Sansa dashed off to don riding leathers and fur, while Jon oversaw the allocation of soldiers, Davos emerged, intercepting Jon near the stables. "You're riding out?" he asked, urgency in his tone. Jon nodded. "Glover's pinned near Deepwood, Moat. I'll not let loyal men die at the hands of Bolton's scum." Davos threw up his hands. "Take care, lad. We still need you here." "No." Jon mounted his horse, the beast snorting clouds of steam in the icy air. "I'll come back," he vowed. The war against the dead would not wait, nor would the realm's other threats. But first, they would root out this last vestige of Bolton malice. He glanced up at the ramparts, where scattered figures stood watching. A sense of déjà vu washed over him. Another ride into danger. Another desperate fight in a land scarred by betrayal. Sansa rode up beside him, her cheeks pale, but her eyes unwavering. "I'm ready," she said, voice steady. Jon nodded. He turned to the soldiers assembled behind them. A mix of wildlings, northerners, and a handful of Vale knights who'd remained at Winterfell. "We ride for Deepwood Moat. The Boltons have no claim on the north. Let's show them." The soldiers raised their swords, a wordless cheer disappearing into the swirl of snow. With that, the gates creaked open, and the rescue party galloped out into the whitening landscape. Winterfell's walls shrank behind them, and the wind whipped across the plains. Jon gripped the reins, mind fixed on the mission, heart pounding with a cold resolve. Another test awaited them in the frozen forests. He only hoped they wouldn't be too late. And as the hooves thundered south and west, Jon Snow, king in the north by the will of his people, rode once more into the uncertainty of war, forging ahead with the grim determination that had seen him through so many battles past. Jon led the column forward into the low, rolling hills that separated Winterfell's lands from the rugged forests around Deepwood Moat. The snowfall grew heavier the farther they rode, the wind picking up to whip each flake sideways. Horses snorted in discomfort, breath pluming in the cold. Icy moisture clung to cloaks, forming crusts of frost around the riders' hoods. Even so, the procession pressed on, determined to reach Lord Glover's position before the situation deteriorated further. He glanced at Sansa, riding a sturdy mare beside him. Her hood was drawn tight, a thick layer of fur framing her features. Despite the biting chill, she kept her posture proud and steady, refusing any offers to turn back. Jon knew it pained her to see the North still riddled with old enemies, pockets of betrayal that refused to die. But that same pain hardened her resolve. If the Bolton loyalists wanted to hang on to the ruins of their defeated cause, they would soon learn that House Stark would not abide them. Davos and a small group of cavalry rode behind, carefully scanning the horizon. In the near distance, the black silhouette of a forest rose, tall pine trees swaying and cracking in the wind. The path narrowed as they approached, snowdrifts gathering in ditches at either side. Occasionally, a rider had to slow down and guide his mount around a patch of uneven ground. There was little conversation. Everyone's nerves seemed coiled tight. Jon thought about the wounded soldier who delivered the message. He had looked half dead, pale as a wraith. Yet he had clung to his duty long enough to warn them. If Glover and his men were out there, surrounded or under siege, time was short. Jon urged his horse onward, leaning forward in the saddle, scanning for tracks. Every so often, he could make out faint impressions in the snow. Hoofprints or footprints, partially covered by fresh drifts. The sign suggested a group had passed here recently. He prayed it was Glover's men. Twilight came early in the north, the gray sky dimming by late afternoon. The troop halted in a small clearing sheltered by thick evergreens so they could rest the horses and let the outriders scout ahead. Small fires were lit in rudimentary pits, the smoke curling upward in pale ribbons. Sansa dismounted slowly, wrapping her cloak tighter and standing near Davos, who warmed his hands over one of the fires. The soldiers murmured among themselves, stamping their feet to keep blood flowing. Jon called over two men with keen eyesight, a ranger from the wall who had joined him months earlier, and a wildling who claimed to have hunted in these forests before. He asked them to ride on a half-mile, see if they could locate any sign of conflict, then return swiftly. They nodded, vanished on their horses between the dark columns of trees. In the hush left behind, Jon and Sansa exchanged a glance. He could see the question in her eyes. Would they find Glover in time, or only the remains of another cruel ambush? The fear simmered, but neither spoke it aloud. Minutes stretched. The men huddled in small knots around the fires. Snow drifted down in thick, lazy clusters, making it impossible to see more than a short distance. Occasionally, a gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, sending a flurry of flakes cascading onto their cloaks. At last, the two scouts returned, horses panting, manes crusted with ice. Their reports came in hurried breaths. Signs of a skirmish about a mile ahead, one said, pushing back his hood to reveal cheeks reddened by cold. Broken arrows in the snow, footprints scattered around. We heard no clash of steel, but there's definitely been fighting. Now, the wildling nodded. There are tracks leading deeper into the forest, away from the main road. Could be Glover's men, or the enemy. Hard to say without risking a full confrontation. Jon digested this, rubbing his gloved hands together. We'll proceed carefully. No sense galloping into another ambush. We'll spread out in a wide line. Move slow, stay alert for traps. He gave instructions to the men. Davos, wearing a thick knit cap beneath his hood, helped direct them into small squads, each keeping a short distance from the next. Sansa insisted on riding near Jon, and though he worried for her safety, he also recognized that she had a claim to her own will. She would not be sheltered at Winterfell when her loyal men needed them both. They extinguished the fires, ensuring no bright light would give away their position, then mounted up again. The snow crunched under hooves, a muffled rhythmic sound. They threaded their way between towering pines, low-hanging branches brushing against riders' shoulders. The hiss of the wind through the needles formed a constant background. Murmur. The sky turned a dusky purple, making it difficult to gauge the path. Only the occasional broken arrow shaft or a patch of churned snow indicated that others had been through here in haste. As they pressed on, Jon's mind drifted, unsettled by the darkness. He recalled how many times he'd traveled in winter's gloom, whether on the wall or beyond it. He remembered the bitter nights under the stars, the watchfires that seemed so small and fragile against the vast emptiness of the cold. Danger had always lurked just beyond the flickering light. This time the stakes were different. He was king in the north, and these were his men. Each step they took carried the weight of that responsibility. A distant shout cut through the silence, followed by the muffled clang of steel. Jon's heart leapt, and he raised his fist, signaling the group to halt. Everyone froze, straining to listen. Another shout, more desperate, echoed among the pines. It was impossible to see far, but Sansa leaned over, whispering, "Someone's in trouble." Jon slid from his saddle and passed the reins to one of the men. "Stay with the horses," he ordered quietly. "Form a perimeter here. I'll take a small group forward." Before Sansa could protest, he locked eyes with her. "This might be a trap. Wait here, please." She hesitated, torn between caution and her impulse to help. At last she nodded, though her gaze burned with concern. Davos eased off his own horse. "I'll come," he said simply, no argument in his tone. They chose half a dozen men to accompany them on foot, moving quietly among the trees. Snow crunched beneath boots, but they did their best to step lightly. The flickers of steel on steel grew more distinct as they advanced. Jon's heart pounded, adrenaline sharpening his senses. Through the trunks he glimpsed movement, a fight unfolding in a clearing. Moonlight filtered down, illuminating patches of churned snow dotted with dark stains. He spotted half a dozen men locked in a brutal clash. More bodies lay scattered, unmoving. One figure, wearing Glover's sigil, parried a blow from a taller opponent. Another man, presumably on Glover's side, struggled on one knee, a broken sword in his hand. Jon gestured for his group to fan out. Stepping forward, he shouted a challenge that carried across the clearing. The fight wavered as heads turned. Jon burst into motion, sword glinting in the faint light. The taller opponent swung around with a snarl. He wore no heraldry, just battered leather, but the fury in his eyes spoke volumes. Bolton scum were some sellsword in their pay. Jon's sword met his in a sharp clash. The man was strong, pushing Jon back a step. But Jon channeled his training, twisting free and slicing across the man's side, drawing a guttural cry. He pressed the advantage, driving the man to his knees. A savage downward blow ended the threat. Davos and the others engaged the rest. The clearing erupted with a din of steel and the ragged cries of wounded men. Glover's soldier, relieved by the new reinforcements, lashed out at his attacker, cutting him down. Another sellsword tried to flee into the trees, but two of Jon's men intercepted him. A brief scuffle ended with the sellsword sprawled, bleeding in the snow. Breathing hard, Jon looked around, sword still raised. Blood pounded in his ears. The clearing was littered with the dead or dying. One last foe, injured, tried to crawl away, but Davos struck him with the pommel of his sword, knocking him out cold. Jon hurried to the Glover soldier on his knees, who peered up with wild, grateful eyes. Where is Lord Glover?" Jon asked, voice rough from exertion. The soldier panted, wincing as he clutched his wounded forearm. "Hey, he's about half a mile north, maybe. We got separated. They attacked us in waves, drawing us deeper into the trees. Some of our men tried to stand ground, but we were overrun. I fear the worst, my lord." "Ayans." Jon swallowed hard. "We'll find him." He motioned two of his men closer. "See to his wounds. Then fall back to the main force." His eyes swept across the scattered bodies. At least half wore Glover's colors, lying still in the snow. A pang of anger and guilt lanced through Jon. These were men who had answered Winterfell's call, now cut down by stubborn remnants of cruelty. Careful not to lose time, he pressed forward, leading Davos and the others deeper into the forest. The moonlight waned, and a swirl of clouds drifted across, plunging them into shifting shadow. Eyes alert, they passed more signs of struggle. A dropped shield, bloody footprints, a snapped spear. The gloom made it difficult to navigate, but they moved steadily north, trusting the soldiers' directions. Moments later, Jon heard an echo of voices. He raised a hand, signaling the group to pause. Crouching low behind a stand of snow-laden pines, he peered ahead. A faint glow flickered, likely from a small fire. Shapes moved in that light, at least 3 or 4 men. Above them, pinned to a broken branch, hung a piece of cloth bearing the flayed man of House Bolton. It twisted in the wind, though battered and stained, a vile reminder of Ramsay's legacy. Jon's chest tightened at the sight. He could almost hear the mocking laughter of the man who had tormented Sansa and murdered Rickon. Though Ramsay Bolton lay dead, his shadow persisted. Silently, Jon motioned for his group to spread out, forming a half-circle around the makeshift camp. He crawled forward, bracing a gloved hand against a tree trunk for balance. By the weak light of the campfire, he could make out a captive figure bound to a fallen log. The shape of his clothes suggested it might be Glover himself. Another man, similarly bound, lay unmoving nearby, possibly unconscious or worse. A handful of Bolton loyalists huddled around the fire. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, spoke in a hushed tone. "We should slit the bastards' throats and be done with it. Then move on before dawn." Another, heavier set with broad shoulders, shook his head. "Not yet. We need them to lure more Starks out here. Didn't you see that squad we picked off earlier? If we keep this one alive, maybe we can force a ransom." Jon felt a surge of rage, but he forced himself to remain quiet. He shot a quick glance at Davos, who nodded. 2 of their men stole around the perimeter, getting into position behind the loyalists. When Jon judged the moment right, he shot to his feet, blade ready, and crashed into the circle of light with the fury of a winter storm. The loyalists scrambled, cursing. Scarface lurched up, grabbing a hatchet from the ground. Jon slashed in a swift arc, forcing him to backpedal. The big man reached for a sword, but took an arrow from one of Jon's archers. He roared in pain before another arrow found his chest, sending him crashing to his knees. 2 more loyalists rushed in from the side, desperate to defend their makeshift camp. Davos engaged one, parrying a wild overhead strike and countering with a thrust that bit deep into the man's abdomen. The loyalist crumpled, leaving a smear of blood across the snow. The last foe, a bearded man with furious eyes, threw himself at Jon, brandishing a short blade. Jon sidestepped deftly, pivoting on one foot, then hammered the pommel of his sword against the attacker's skull. The man staggered, disoriented, and a final blow took him down. In seconds, the fight was over. Panting, Jon looked around, ensuring no other threats lingered. Blood spattered the ground near the dying fire. Steam rose from the wounded, their groans punctuating the hush. Davos kicked aside a discarded axe, scanning the trees for further movement. No more emerged. At once, Jon rushed to the bound figure. "Lord Glover," he called, kneeling. By the ember's glow, he could see the older lord's face was pale, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. A deep cut on his temple trickled blood over his brow. His wrists, tied behind his back, were raw from struggling. Glover managed a weak nod. "Snow, or should I say, King in the North." A tremulous smile ghosted across his lips, pained but relieved. Jon's heart twisted. He cut the ropes and eased Glover onto his side, gently pressing a hand to the wound on his head. "We've got you," he said. "We'll get you back to safety." Another man lay bound nearby, and Davos bent to check for a pulse. He shook his head, grim. Dead. He cut the ropes anyway, letting the limp body slump. One more casualty in a fight that felt endless. Glover coughed, wincing at the motion. "I lost most of my men. They ambushed us. Knew the terrain. Led us around by the nose." He tried to push himself up, but Jon steadied him. "Don't worry about that now," Jon said. "We'll find whoever's left. The rest of our force is nearby." Already, more shapes emerged from the darkness. Jon's men who had heard the fight and came running. Among them was the soldier from earlier, bandaged but upright, relieved to see his lord alive. As they gathered around the dying fire, the realization set in. They had struck one group of Bolton loyalists, but there might be others lurking in the woods. The situation would require a thorough sweep if they meant to clear the region fully. Sansa, ignoring Jon's earlier request to stay behind, arrived soon after with a contingent of soldiers. Her eyes went wide at the sight of Glover, battered and bloodied, but alive. Tension in her posture lessened. She hurried forward. "My lord, thank the gods," she said, helping him take a sip from a water skin offered by one of their men. Glover grimaced in pain but managed a nod. "You came in time, my lady." Sansa met Jon's gaze. "We'll need a camp," she said softly. "He's in no condition to ride all the way back to Winterfell tonight." Jon agreed. The temperature was dropping further, the wind biting. They needed shelter and proper medical attention for the wounded. Already, 2 men had begun clearing the area of bodies, dragging them away from the campfire so they wouldn't have to stare at the carnage. Others stoked the flames back to life and scoured the ground for any leftover supplies or gear the loyalists had abandoned. They rigged a temporary shelter out of canvas and pine boughs, just enough to keep the worst of the wind off Glover and the other injured. Sansa supervised, ensuring that blankets were draped over him, that the small traveling kit of medicinal herbs was fetched from the supply mules. Jon stood guard at the perimeter, sword still in hand, scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of movement. His breath came out in ragged clouds, the surge of battle adrenaline slowly ebbing. Davos approached him, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's lucky to be alive. Hard to say how many men he lost." Jon nodded grimly. "We'll search for survivors at first light. For now, we post double sentries." Davos bowed his head in agreement. Nearby, Sansa knelt by Glover, speaking in a low, soothing tone. Jon caught snippets of her words, an assurance that his sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten, that the Bolton filth would be rooted out for good this time. Glover's eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion dragging him down, but Sansa placed a hand on his forearm in comfort. Their ragged party formed a half-circle around the shelter, using some fallen logs and thick brush as a windbreak. The horses were tied just behind, lathered from the ride and the excitement, stamping the ground restlessly. Though they had no tents large enough for everyone, they set up small lean-tos or simply wrapped themselves in furs and blankets, determined to make do until morning. Jon took a moment to walk among the men, acknowledging their efforts. Some quietly asked if they would return to Winterfell at dawn, anxious about the possibility of more Bolton loyalists. Jon offered what reassurance he could, that they would finish the job and ensure no more ambushes threatened the roads. Yet in his heart, he felt a gnawing worry. How many more pockets of these traitors lay scattered through the north? Later, he sat near the central fire with Sansa, Davos, and a few of the more seasoned soldiers. Snow drifted around them, illuminated by the flames' glow. One of the men distributed hardtack and strips of dried meat. As they ate in relative silence, the crackle of the fire seemed oddly loud. Sansa's face was pale, but her eyes reflected the firelight, unwavering. Jon set aside his meager meal and rubbed warmth into his hands. "This cannot continue," he said quietly, gaze flicking between the others. "We have to put an end to these remnants of the Boltons once and for all. Otherwise, they'll pick us apart, harass our supply lines. They might even accept coin from the Lannisters if that means hurting us. We can't let that happen." Davos nodded. "It's the right move. But we'll need more than a quick raid. These forests are vast, easy to hide in. We might have to station men at Deepwood Moat permanently, rid the area of these vermin for good." "Baal?" Sansa's voice was firm. "We will do it. Once we have Glover stable enough to travel, we'll gather more forces from Winterfell and properly secure his lands. Make them see that the North stands together." A few men voiced agreement. One soldier from House Sherwin spat into the snow. "Never thought I'd see the day where a Bolton banner still flew here. Can't wait to tear every last one down." "Namnardi." Jon said nothing more for a time, letting the conversation flow, though he kept his senses alert. Eventually, as the fire burned lower and the men broke off into smaller groups to rest, he and Sansa checked on Glover one more time. The Lord was asleep, thanks to a mixture of herbs and sheer fatigue, his injuries wrapped in claw. His breathing was shallow but steady. Exhaustion gnawed at Jon's bones. His muscles ached from the ride, the fight, the cold. Sansa looked equally drained, though she tried to hide it behind a composed facade. He offered her a thin smile. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll take a turn on watch." She opened her mouth as if to protest, but then nodded, eyes flicking to the men slumped around the fire. "Wake me if anything happens," she told him, her voice subdued. Jon stood, wrapped his cloak tighter, and moved toward the edge of the clearing. A soldier from House Mormont was posted there, bow in hand, scanning the tree line. The darkness was thick, broken only by the faint white of snow and the black silhouettes of pines. Jon quietly took position beside him, gazing out at the shifting shadows. The wind had eased, leaving an almost eerie calm. A wolf howled in the distance, a lone cry across the stark wilderness. Time passed slowly. Jon drifted in and out of a half-conscious state, memories of the day's events mingling with older recollections. Battles, betrayals, fleeting triumphs. In his mind's eye he saw Rickon once more, and the arrow that had ended his life. The pang of grief twisted inside him. How many times would the Boltons' legacy scar this family? At some point, he sensed movement nearby and turned, sword half drawn. But it was only Davos, stepping over a fallen branch. The old knight nodded in greeting. "Couldn't sleep," he said softly. "Your watch is nearly over anyway. Best get some rest before dawn." Jon wanted to argue, but his limbs were heavy. He gave Davos a weary nod, sheathed his sword, and made his way back to the dim glow of the dying fire. He found a patch of ground where pine needles offered a thin buffer against the cold earth. Pulling his cloak around him, he settled down, listening to the quiet crackle of embers. Nearby, Sansa slept with her head propped on a makeshift pillow, her breath faint in the hush. He let himself drift. In the realm of restless dreams, he saw the north as a vast white expanse, dotted with pockets of darkness. Malice, hatred, old grudges that refused to yield. He dreamed of an immense host of whites marching through the snow, unstoppable, unstoppable, until a roar overhead snapped his vision. He looked up in the dream, glimpsing a fire-breathing shape in the sky. A dragon? Or just a phantom of hope? Then the dream changed, swallowing him in swirling shadows, leaving him uncertain whether light or darkness would prevail. When morning came, pale and grim, a fresh layer of snow had covered everything in a thick, pristine blanket. Men stirred, groaning as they rose stiff-limbed from the cold ground. Horses stomped and huffed, steam billowing from their muzzles. Sansa was already awake, talking quietly to the makeshift healer who had been tending Glover. Jon shook off the remnants of sleep and forced himself to stand, brushing snow from his cloak. "How is he?" Jon asked, approaching the shelter. The healer, a stout man who had once trained under a maester, inclined his head. "Weak, but stable for now. If we can get him back to Winterfell, or at least to Deepwood Moat where he can rest properly, he should recover." Sansa smoothed a stray curl behind her ear. "We should move soon. This place isn't safe." Jon agreed. "We'll form 2 groups. One escorts Lord Glover back to the Moat, once we check if the castle is intact, and the other scours the surrounding woods for any more loyalists." Davos stepped forward, hands cradling a bowl of hot oats. "Take half the men for the sweep," he advised. "We can't be sure we've eliminated them all. They might be waiting for us to leave." Jon nodded. "I'll lead the sweep. Sansa, go with Glover. Secure the moat and keep him safe." Sansa looked torn between frustration and acceptance. "You'll be careful." He managed a faint smile. "I promise." Within the hour, they broke camp. Glover was loaded onto a makeshift litter that could be pulled by horseback. He drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally moaning when the litter jostled. Sansa and a cadre of soldiers set off southward, taking the clearest path toward Deepwood Moat, though they'd remain alert for any more ambushes. The forest around them felt eerily quiet in the morning light, the thick pines looming overhead like silent sentinels. Jon, Davos, and roughly 30 fighters pressed eastward, retracing some of the steps from the night before. Tracks were easier to see in daylight, but the swirling snow made it a challenge to distinguish older signs from the new Oakshire. They moved slowly, stopping often to listen. Now and then, a bird would caw overhead, but for the most part, the world felt drained of color and sound, an endless drift of white and gray. As they advanced, their pace picked up. Jon felt a growing sense of urgency. The longer they delayed, the more time any remaining Bolton loyalists had to flee or regroup. He wanted to end this threat today if possible, so that the North could focus on more pressing dangers. But the thought of how widespread these renegade pockets might be filled him with a simmering anger. They found an abandoned campsite, the ashes of a fire still warm. Someone had been there very recently. Scattered footprints suggested 3 or 4 men, maybe more, had bolted upon hearing their approach. Davos crouched, running a gloved hand through the disturbed snow. "They left in a hurry, probably hurt our horses." Jon nodded. "We keep after them." They pressed on, forging through a cluster of dense evergreens until the path opened into a narrow valley. Frozen streams meandered along the valley floor, the water beneath the ice glinting like hidden veins of silver. The riders fanned out in pairs, scanning the slopes above for any sign of movement. Jon kept his sword hand free, eyes narrowed against the glare of snow. A hush seemed to envelop the valley. Suddenly, an arrow whistled from above, embedding itself in the snow just yards from one of Jon's men. Instantly, chaos erupted. More arrows rained down, clattering off shields and snapping on stones. "Up there," Davos shouted, pointing to a rocky ledge partially hidden by scraggly pines. Figures moved among the boulders, at least half a dozen. "Shields," Jon roared. The men raised wooden or metal shields, forming a haphazard defense. Another arrow struck the side of a horse, which reared and threw its rider. A jolt of panic spread as men tried to control their mounts. "Dismount," Jon ordered. They needed to approach on foot to avoid losing more horses to the valley. With practiced speed, some of the men slid off their saddles and found partial cover behind rocks or the natural rise of the land. Jon crouched behind a boulder, glancing around. "We have to flush them out," he said to Davos, who was next to him, breathing hard. "They've got the high ground," Davos muttered, wincing as another arrow clattered nearby. "We'll be sitting ducks if we charge up that slope." Jon ground his teeth. "We circle around. You take 10 men to the west, I'll take 10 to the east. We converge on them." Then Davos nodded. Understood. A chaotic scramble ensued as Jon relayed the plan to the others, yelling over the pounding of arrows. A few men readied their own bows, returning fire with limited visibility. One or two loyalists cried out as an arrow found its mark. But the advantage of height remained formidable. The slope was steep, strewn with loose rocks and slippery from snowmelt. Jon led his group east, weaving between stands of pines, hugging the slope. The arrow fire slackened as the loyalists realized they needed to reposition to maintain line of sight. Jon urged his men forward, clambering up the slope, step by step. Snow slid beneath their boots, forcing them to dig in or grab roots for support. The sting of cold wind whipped at their faces. Up above, shapes flitted behind a rocky outcrop. Jon's heart hammered. They could be walking into a trap, but there was no other choice. He remembered the cunning tactics of Ramsay Bolton, drawing foes into kill zones, using the terrain to advantage. He refused to let that kind of cruelty continue in the north. A sudden figure emerged above them, sword raised. Jon recognized the scarred face from the night before. The same man had struck down, or so he'd thought. The loyalist must have survived, though badly wounded. Blood caked his tunic, but his expression burned with rage. He lunged downslope, slashing at Jon with surprising ferocity. Jon barely deflected the blow, the ring of steel echoing. Another loyalist came from the side, forcing one of Jon's men to parry desperately. The slope erupted into a desperate melee. Men slipped on icy rock, sometimes grappling each other in the snow. Jon's vision narrowed, adrenaline surging, as he locked blades again with the scar-faced loyalist. The man's eyes were wild, a guttural snarl on his lips as he shoved forward. Jon pivoted, hooking the loyalist's leg to send him off balance. A savage elbow to the man's wounded side tore a cry from him and he staggered. Jon ended it with a driving thrust that bit deep into the loyalist's chest, the life in those furious eyes flickering out. All around the swirl of combat continued. Another loyalist attempted to stab Jon from behind, but one of his men tackled the attacker, both tumbling into a drift. Jon pivoted in time to see Davos and his group cresting the ridge from the west. They stormed in, swords flashing, overwhelming the defenders with sudden force. An arrow from below whizzed past, grazing the edge of Jon's cloak. He half-turned, scanning for the archer, but it was too late. One of Jon's bowmen had loosed a return shot that struck the archer dead on. In moments, it was over. A hush fell, broken only by the rasp of labored breathing and the moans of the injured. Snow lay trampled and stained, bodies strewn among the rocks. Davos lifted his sword, surveying the carnage. That might be the last of them here, he managed, voice raw. Jon didn't respond immediately. His gaze lingered on the corpses. More northern men claimed by a fight that should have ended the day Ramsay died. He exhaled a cloud of cold breath, then turned to check on his own men. Several were wounded, some severely, but they still breathed. One man lay motionless, an arrow in his throat. Jon swallowed the rising bitterness as he knelt beside the fallen soldier, recognizing him as a quiet youth from House Hornwood. There would be another name to add to the list of those lost. Gently, Jon closed the youth's eyes. They regrouped in a clearing a short distance away, taking stock. Davos spoke softly with the men, organizing a makeshift triage for the wounded. Jon wiped his sword clean on the edge of his cloak before sheathing it, a gesture that felt both necessary and hollow. Each fresh victory left behind the sour taste of loss. He looked over the slope, mind turning to Sansa and Glover. They should be nearing Deepwood Moat by now, hopefully unopposed. Jon prayed that was the case. If more pockets like this were scattered across the region, it would take weeks, maybe months, to fully purge them. Time they didn't have, with winter deepening and the threat of the White Walkers looming. But ignoring these traitors would only give them room to spread more chaos. A few survivors of the ambush lay groaning in the snow. Jon's men moved to disarm them, gathering their weapons in a heap. One loyalist cursed them with a failing breath, hissing that the Boltons would return in vengeance. Another gasped for mercy, claiming he was forced to fight. Jon cast a grim glance at the latter, remembering how the prisoner back in Winterfell had spun a similar tale. There was truth in some of these stories. Ramsay's cruelty had forced many into compliance. But the lines had long since blurred. Jon had neither the time nor the inclination to unravel each man's guilt. They would be taken to Deepwood Moat and judged. That would have to do. After binding the survivors, they gathered themselves for the trek back. They formed two litters for the worst of the wounded, lashing together branches. The rest trudged carefully down the slope, leading or carrying the injured, each step precarious. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the bleak landscape in harsh, white light. Plumes of steam rose from sweaty horses, which had to be calmed before bearing any more riders. It was late morning when they began the final leg toward Deepwood Moat. The wind had picked up again, flattening the tall pines, scattering needles across the snowy ground. Jon and Davos rode at the front, a quiet, somber mood settling over the men. Clouds churned overhead, threatening another snowfall. Every so often, Jon heard the muffled groan of a wounded soldier, or the hiss of pain when a litter jostled on a rock. He clenched the reins, jaw set. The cost of purging the north of Bolton remnants was growing by the hour. At last, they emerged from the forest onto a ridge overlooking the Moat. Deepwood Moat's wooden walls and towers rose from the snowy expanse below, partially blending into the stark surroundings. Jon could make out a cluster of tents near the gates. Likely Sansa and the others. They urged their horses forward, descending a winding path. As they neared the fortress, they saw watchmen on the walls, who shouted down to open the gates. Inside, the courtyard was busy with men organizing supplies, tending to injuries, and stabling horses. Sansa stood near the main gate, a swirl of relief crossing her face when she saw Jon leading the group in. He dismounted, passing the reins to a stable hand, and found Sansa stepping toward him. "You're safe," she breathed, scanning him for wounds. "More or less," he said, voice low. "We lost some men, but we've put down another group of loyalists." Her face clouded with sorrow, but she swallowed and changed the subject. "Glover's inside. He's stable, though feverish. The castle's mostly intact, though his household guard has taken losses." Jon nodded. He followed her through the courtyard, surveying the battered fortress. The wooden ramparts showed signs of recent repairs, probably from earlier skirmishes. A hush lay over the yard, broken by the occasional bark of orders or the clang of a hammer. They found Glover in what passed for the great hall, a solid structure of wood and stone with a central hearth. He lay on a makeshift cot near the fire, bandages wrapped around his head and torso. A few men of House Glover hovered around, stoic-faced. When Jon stepped closer, Glover's eyes flickered open. He managed a faint nod. "I hear you cut down some more of those bastards," he rasped. "We did," Jon confirmed, kneeling beside him. "Your lands will be safe again. We'll station men here to ensure no more loyalists take root." He hesitated, unsure how to phrase the next part. "But in return, we need your help strengthening the north, Lord Glover. We can't keep losing men in these skirmishes with winter closing in." Glover's gaze moved to Sansa, then back to Jon. "You'll have it. Deepwood Moat stands with House Stark. We'll rally what forces remain. The Boltons are finished." Jon's chest eased fractionally, though the day's events weighed on him like a lead cloak. "Rest, my lord," he said gently. He withdrew to let the healers continue their work. Sansa followed him out into the corridor, which was lit by dim torches. The flickering light outlined the worry lines on her face. She spoke softly, mindful of the men nearby. "We should send word to Winterfell. Tell them what happened, so they can prepare to send reinforcements and supplies for these lands." Jon nodded, leaning his back against the wall. His exhaustion was palpable in the slack of his shoulders. "Yes, and we need to organize a proper garrison here. Enough to protect the moat from any more attacks." "And Sal." She reached out, lightly touching his forearm. "You did what was necessary. We both did. If not for this intervention, Glover and his men would be dead." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting her reassurance settle. The memory of fresh blood on snow still swirled in his mind, but he reminded himself that the alternative would have been far worse. "I know," he said at last, opening his eyes to meet hers. "But there's so much else to face. We keep dividing our strength." Sansa's lips tightened. "If we don't eliminate these traitors, there won't be a north left to defend when the White Walkers arrive. We have no choice." A faint trace of admiration mingled with Joan's weariness. Her steel was unbending, just like the girl he recalled from childhood, yet changed by suffering and survival into a woman who refused to be bowed. "We'll make it through," he said, as much to assure himself as her. They spent the next hours organizing the battered men into squads, checking the castle's defenses, and ensuring a reliable watch was posted. Davos took charge of rationing supplies, though it was a grim tile. Deepwood Moat had been partially neglected, and winter had already cut off reliable trade routes. If reinforcements and provisions didn't arrive soon, they'd face the grim choice of returning to Winterfell or risking starvation. By nightfall, the men were settled in as best they could be. Fires burned in makeshift hearths, casting shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Some slept in cramped corridors or the courtyard, sharing blankets and furs. Others patrolled the ramparts, eyes scanning the starlit wilderness for any sign of another incursion. Jon found himself in the small solar that once belonged to the castle's lordate. The room was plain, with a single window overlooking the courtyard and a battered wooden desk. A set of Glover family banners hung on one wall. The one was torn from some past conflict. Sansa stood by the window, arms folded, gazing at the faint glow of torches below. He stepped up beside her, letting the quiet stretch. She finally broke it. "I remember when I was younger, hearing stories about Deepwood Moat as an old fortress by the sea. It was said to be cozy compared to Winterfell. I never imagined it'd be here like this, fleeing from one horror after another." Jon looked at her profile, noticing the set of her jaw. "Life in the north rarely goes as we hope," he said gently. "But that's why we keep fighting. The north is our home." She turned her head, meeting his eyes. "I know. And right now we have to make it stronger, or it will shatter." He nodded, a heavy acceptance in his sigh. "We'll send word to Winterfell at first light. Ask them to dispatch more men, fresh supplies, a proper maester if possible. We'll hold here until Glover recovers enough to manage on his own or until we're certain the area is secure." She studied him quietly. And after that, his thoughts turned to the threats beyond. Rumors of Lannister scouts in the Vale, the uncertain allegiances of the South, the unstoppable approach of winter itself. "We return to Winterfell, gather our strength," he said. "We can't ignore the White Walkers. Every day we spend here is a day they draw closer." Bendero. Her hand slipped to the windowsill, fingers tracing the rough stone. "And if a southern army comes knocking in the meantime," Jon's jaw tightened, "then we'll do what we must. But I pray they have the sense to see reason, or at least to realize that the North won't bow so easily." She nodded, though her eyes shone with worry. Turning back to the view, she seemed lost in thought. Jon let the silence linger a moment longer, then cleared his throat. "Try to sleep. There's a decent chamber down the hall. I'll be on the ramparts, making sure the watch is set." "Davos." She glanced at him, searching his expression. "Take care of yourself, Jon. You always carry too much on your shoulders." He offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Someone has to." She stepped close, placing a hand on his cheek, a brief gesture of familial concern. Then she withdrew, heading for the door. He watched her go, a pang of gratitude and sadness mingling in his chest. Only once she had disappeared down the corridor did he exhale, allowing weariness to wash over him. Jon climbed to the top of the Moat's main tower, boots thudding on the wooden steps. The wind buffeted him as he stepped onto the parapet. From up here, the forest spread like a dark ocean under the cold moon. Tendrils of snow dusted the rooftops. He could see the occasional torchlight flickering in the courtyard below, proof that not all had turned in for the night. A pair of Glover guards stood watch, huddled against the rampart to avoid the worst of the biting wind. They saluted him respectfully. He acknowledged them with a nod, then walked along the parapet to a spot where he could look out over the gates. The wood creaked under his boots. Scenes of the day replayed in his mind, arrows hissing from above, the clang of steel, the quiet heartbreak of burying another loyal soldier in the snow. His gaze drifted to the far horizon, as though searching for any sign of the army of the dead. Of course, there was nothing but darkness. Yet he felt them out there, gathering. The realms squabbled over crowns and feuds, while an unimaginable horror bided its time. Jon closed his eyes briefly, feeling the cold sting on his cheeks. He thought of the vow he had made in the godswood at Winterfell, to protect the living, no matter what. The mantle of the king in the north weighed heavy, but it also steadied him. If wearing a crown meant forging the alliances necessary to defeat the nightmarish threat, he would do it. If it meant riding into 100 more skirmishes like this one, so be it. He opened his eyes again to the silent winter night, renewed determination smoldering within. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, letters to be sent, men to be reorganized, Glover to be tended. The North would not be tamed in a single day. But step by step, they would cleanse these lands of any who dared cling to the Bolton's cruelty. And if the White Walkers descended in all their terrible might, Jon Snow would stand at the forefront, rallying the North's battered but unbroken spirit against the oncoming storm. For a few more minutes, he lingered there, a solitary figure against the midnight sky, cloak rippling in the wind. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely cry that echoed across the snowbound forests. Jon felt its resonance deep in his bones, a reminder of the ancient bond between Stark and Wolf, man and wilderness. It reminded him of Ghost, somewhere out there, perhaps prowling the winter nights. He allowed himself the faintest hope that the direwolf was safe, that they would be reunited soon, just as he hoped to unite the North under a single cause. When he finally made his way back down the tower steps, the watchmen stayed behind, vigilant against any threat that might creep in the darkness. Jon found a small corner in the old keep, setting himself against the wall with a cloak for a pillow. He eased down, exhaustion claiming every muscle. Through the cracked window, moonlight spilled in a pale, ghostly shaft, illuminating his face. He let his head rest on the rough stone behind him, letting his eyes close. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the swirl of half-remembered nightmares. Blue flames dancing in the eyes of the dead. The echo of Rickon's name carried on a frigid wind. The fleeting image of a dragon's silhouette, etched against a burning sky. Then the visions faded into a dark, dreamless void, where, for a few hours, he found a brief semblance of oblivion from the weight of his realm's woes. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the endless burdens of duty and the uncertain promise of fragile hope.